Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so picking back up again with the War of Realms, this is actually the conclusion. I mean, there's a conclusion of this, which is actually pretty legit. Like, it's pretty solid, and I actually really dug it. Now, here's kind of the funny thing, though. Odin's son is kind of an idiot, and the reason why is because, like, this whole thing picks out, remember, like, Odin and Freya, like, Thor's parents, had basically been captured by Malekith, and so the way the whole, I guess, kind of like magical barrier had been established by Malekith was to ensure that no other Avengers, nobody besides Thor came in, that only Thor could pass through it. And so what Thor ended up doing was actually going to the Norns, the tree of Yggdrasil, and then in turn, like, taking out one of his eyes, basically like costing himself an eye for wisdom, and then like basically learning the way to essentially defeat Malekith. Now, this is kind of ironic for two reasons. One, because again, Thor's kind of an idiot. I guess Odin's son's kind of an idiot. And two, he's done this before. For people who are looking at this, they're like, but I already thought Thor took an eye out. And that's true, but that was during the events of Ragnarok. When Thor came back during J. Michael Straczynski's run after Ragnarok, he had both of his eyes, and he has ever since. The idea here is that much like we saw during the Ragnarok event, in order to basically gain the wisdom of Odin, he had to follow the same steps as Odin, which was to remove one of his eyes. And so what that basically meant was that he saw essentially the way to defeat Malekith. Now, the other reason, really the second reason here, and the reason why I say that Odin's son's kind of an idiot, is because what he ends up learning is that the only way to defeat Malekith is to get all the versions of himself from across time and band them together in order to fight. Now, it's kind of funny because he's done that before, and you would think like that'd be his first thing, right? Like, well, I mean, we defeated God Butcher when we all came together from like 3 different time periods, so like, let's do that again. Like, you'd think he would figure it out on his own, but I guess not. Which is kind of ironic. Still, the funny thing about this is that when they all start to band together, it really is, in a lot of ways, it's kind of a send-off, right? And that's kind of the irony of this, is because when I look at this, and I look at the idea of them making a return, in truth, like, I would have switched them, and I would have had, like, this War of Realms, basically kind of, the circumstance anyway, like with Malekith and all that, I would have done that in place of, like, God Butcher, and then I would have made God Butcher a villain that everybody had to face off against, right? Because God Butcher was super strong. He had the all-black necro sword of Null, the symbiote god. He had, like, all these crazy abilities. He was super powerful. And it took like all 3 Thors couldn't really even beat him at the same time. Like, he managed, like, it ended up taking Thor using 2 hammers and the power of the all-black necro sword in order to defeat Gore the God Butcher. So it's kind of crazy because when you sit them side by side, this almost kind of seems a little anticlimactic in comparison to what we saw at the very beginning of Jason Aaron's run with the God Butcher storyline. Having said that, the God Butcher storyline was so good that it really is kind of hard to top that. Like, it was pretty amazing. Like, it was pretty stellar. But we basically have like modern, like present day Odin's son. We've got his future version, right? So like the all-father Thor, like from however many millennia into the future. And then you've got his past self. And then of course you have Jane Foster. So you kind of have like these different iterations of Thor. Now the funny thing about this is, remember, Mjolnir had basically been thrown into the sun, right? And the belief was that it had been destroyed, or at the very least was beyond reach for like Odin's son to go and grab himself. The funny thing is that what Jane Foster had done is she had actually reformed the hammer of Thor from like the Ultimate Universe, right? Like the War Thor, essentially like reforming his hammer that he had taken after Thor from the Ultimate Universe had lost it. But it's really just kind of being held together by what's essentially like shoestrings, right? It's literally like it's on its last leg after having been reformed. But at the very least, like the cool thing about this is it kind of addresses the situation that, like, hey, they're kind of a ragtag band, right? Like, they're running on what they have. They're like the Rebel Alliance from Star Wars, right? Like, they're just kind of, it's like a shoestring budget, basically keeping everything together. Hope is the only thing that keeps them alive, by all standards of measurement. And so you essentially have like Thor from the past, who, remember, at that point in his past had not become worthy enough to lift Mjolnir because he hadn't faced off against Hela in order to save Sif. So he hadn't reached that point in his history yet. But then you've also got modern day Odin's son, you've got Jane Foster, and then you've got future Thor. So you got 4 Thors who basically come racing into this place. And it's kind of a funny thing, because when that happens, Malekith's response is, okay, but like only Thor should be able to access this. And it's like, yeah, but it's all Thors from different time periods, which seems to be the one thing that Malekith didn't account for. Now, the other thing about this too is that Malekith has actually bonded himself to the Venom symbiote. Now, here's a crazy thing about that. When it came to the Venom tie-in for War of Realms, that dealt with Eddie Brock, and we didn't really know what was going to be happening with the Venom symbiote. And it kind of makes sense because with the way the tie-in was done, a lot of the emphasis has kind of been focused directly on Eddie Brock in terms of where he goes next, which is really a large portion of what the Venom story was about, because of the fact that you had like Eddie getting the Venom symbiote back and the two of them kind of working together. Then like their first conflict was with Null, the symbiote god, and then following following that, it went into the revelation that like Eddie Brock had a son. Following trends, if history repeats itself, then like the tie-ins will basically still focus on like the main brunt of the story in terms of whatever that tie-in happens to pertain to, in this instance pertaining to Venom. So it would make sense that it would focus on Eddie Brock and not the symbiote. And so with Malekith bonding himself to the symbiote is actually kind of crazy, because one of the things that seems to happen here is we don't hear the voice of the symbiote. We just see like literally Malekith using it for his own ends. Now it's kind of crazy because when this happens and he pops up, he's got a crazy looking face and he's got his wings and so on. But the funny thing here is that Malekith does not use the Venom symbiote to its full totality. And the reason why is because he just doesn't know how. And that's one of the important things to bear in mind. That's one of the reasons why when Lee Price got the Venom symbiote, he didn't have like the full power of the symbiote because he didn't know how to use it in its entirety. It wasn't until like Eddie Brock got it back that it was like a whole new host of powers for the symbiote, because Eddie was able to push it to its limits and then go a little bit further after Null had woke up some of the powers that it previously had that we didn't know about. But this fight that goes on is simultaneous between the fights in like the Secret Avengers and the Frost Giants and so on. It wraps up pretty quickly, like it wraps up pretty fast. But one thing that I want to draw your attention to is that while all of this is happening, while all these fights across, these realms and these forces of Malekith are taking place, that energy is emanating from the sun. A storm is brewing, so to speak, no pun intended, but energy is emanating from the sun. And it's kind of crazy because as that goes on, you end up having some of these trolls who are watching this thing unfold. And what they do is they basically say like in the beginning, there was ice and there was fire, and that was it. And that really sees you what's going on here. Energy and like at least cold energy, like frost energy, and then heat energy from the sun. And one of the trolls comments and says, this is how everything began. This is how all life originated. Now remember, when it comes to the Asgardian legends, in terms of where life began and, with regards to the creation of everything, that's really relegated to Asgard. And Marvel is pretty well accepted, that Odin did not create everything in existence, right? That's just kind of Norwegian mythology, or at least Asgardian mythology. And then that's basically it, right? Like that's really all you get there. So it's really kind of isolated and alone. But what they're doing is they're basically saying like something's being created here, life is being given. Now, the other cool thing about this is that when you have the Secret Avengers, right? So like Captain America's guys and those folks who were facing off against Laufey, the king of the Frost Giants in Jotunheim, he actually consumes the Casket of Ancient Winters. For those guys who don't know, the Casket of Ancient Winters is this literally like this box that if you open it up, it releases the infinite cold of Jotunheim. A lot of you guys saw it in the original Thor movie, that giant casket looking thing that Loki was holding on to when you first learned that he was basically part Frost Giant. That's the Casket of Ancient Winters. You can channel that energy and you can blanket infinite cold across whatever landscape you want to use. And that's what Laufey intends to do, right? Like Laufey's intention is to basically like defeat all these guys here, encase them all in cold, and then travel to Midgard, travel to Earth, and then unleash the power of the Casket of Ancient Winters, which is kind of cool because in truth, like that was really one of Malekith's first big schemes. When Malekith first showed up in Marvel Comics, one of his first big schemes was to steal the Casket of Ancient Winters and open it up on Midgard. And of course, he was defeated and he was stopped. But it's cool to kind of see, Jason Aaron make these little hints to like the history of the Thor mythos and really with the villain of Malekith. But with all these Thors showing up and going against Malekith himself, the reality is that he was totally unprepared for this. And the reason why is because when it comes to Malekith as a character, he's really more of a magical entity, right? So it's like Doctor Strange. And Doctor Strange is very, very powerful when it comes to like magic and sorcery, but he's not much of a fist fighter, right? I mean, if you throw him in like a fist fight with like the Punisher, well, he's gonna get the crap beat out of him because he's really good at magic, he's not really good at fighting. Malekith is much the same way. I mean, granted, he has the enhancements and the various attributes that come along with someone who's of Asgardian mythos, right? So like enhanced strength and speed and durability and all that kind of cool stuff. But when you're talking about him facing off against Thor, that's gonna be a challenge for him in and of himself if he's not really able to wield magic. You have him facing off against 4 Thors and all the magic in the world is not gonna help because it's just gonna be way too much strength, way too much raw power for him to be able to defeat on his own. And that's where his cockiness really begins to get the better of him. And the reason why is because Malekith is aware of who Null is, right? Like the symbiote god. He knows who Null is. He knows the power Null possess. And so because of that, when he bonds himself to the symbiote, his hubris gets carried away. He basically fancies himself a god and very high above his station, like much higher above his station than he actually is. And so the result is that when he faces off against these Thors, he's able to get the upper hand for a short amount of time. But at the end of the day, like once this energy starts to reform, it starts to coalesce in the sun, and suddenly everybody's made aware of what it is that's happening, we end up finding out that what's been going on is the Hammer of Mjolnir has been reformed and it returns right back down to Earth and crashes in front of Odin's son. And so it's the coolest thing because he in turn goes and picks it up and Odin's son gets Mjolnir back. And so like when he gets that, well then the battle's over. Like it's basically done. This fight ends like that. It's the craziest thing, but it's kind of cool because for those who are fans of Thor, right? Like those who are fans of Thor and who have been reading comics for a long time, we all basically knew this is exactly what was going to happen, right? For the new readers, they didn't really know because I mean they haven't really been reading comics long enough to see the kind of patterns that you see. But from the time Thor lost his, or I guess Odin's son lost his hammer until like now. It was only ever a matter of time until he got it back, until he was absolutely worthy of wielding his hammer again, right? And that's kind of the cool thing, because this is like a singular cohesive story arc. So it's like treating it like it's 6 issues, but spread over multiple years with multiple issues. So again, it's the nature of comics. Things change and then they always go back to the way they were before. It always happens that way. So don't get too torn up over things changing. They always go back. After a while, you just learn to realize the pattern and see what's going on. It's like, okay, cool. Like another really good example, Loki was eaten by Laufey and he was believed to have been dead, only to cut himself out. So again, like it's everything always goes back to the status quo. It always has and it always will. I mean, just read comics long enough and I promise you, I promise you, you will see it happen, right? Like Heroes Reborn, Heroes Return. It's the nature of things, right? The actual Heroes Reborn story arc and the actual Heroes Return story arc is really what I'm referring to. Heroes Return sucked, but nonetheless, getting back into this, getting back into the story proper, because of the fact that Odin's son has Mjolnir back, this is really kind of designed to highlight the power of Mjolnir, just what it's capable of. And that's one of the cool things, that if you were really kind of reading between the lines and you were really sort of looking at like the contextual circumstance, the way this played out was like once Mjolnir was gone and then the War of Realms began, hope wasn't really lost so much as things were very, very bleak. But with Mjolnir coming back, because you're talking about a hammer that is by all standards of measurement nearly indestructible and is now back in the hands of Odin's son, then it's just a countdown to when everything ends. It's designed to say, hey, here's what happens when Odin's son, or really like anybody bearing the mantle of Thor, gets Mjolnir back, then like they win. And that's basically it. That's basically the way this goes. And so like literally when I say this fight ends like super quick, I mean it ends in like 3 pages. Like literally like the hammer comes back, Malekith gets hit in the face, and then he gets carried away. And that's basically it. He literally gets torn to pieces and carried away. And that's basically it. Like he's done now. And it's kind of like, wow, like that fast, huh? That quick, huh? It's kind of disappointing to see it end that fast. But there are a few things that come out of this. One of the cool things that come out of this is that we're actually going to see like future crossovers between Wolverine and Punisher, which we've seen them before, but they usually fought. It looks like what we're going to be seeing in the future are like team-ups between Wolverine and the Punisher, which I'm actually really, really excited about. Daredevil, of course, loses the eyesight of Heimdall. Heimdall basically goes back to being his normal self, and Daredevil goes back to being blind. The Venom symbiote, oddly enough, because of the fact that he was basically, possessed by a being of dark magic, when Malekith was freed, the Venom symbiote went back to its normal self, right? Like regained its mind essentially. And so now we're going to see how that follows up going into Donny Cates' Venom. Jane Foster, we don't know what's going to happen to her. If I'm a betting man, I would say that she would take over the role of the Valkyries, right? She's going to become the new Valkyrie, because all the Valkyries are dead, right? Like they're all basically, they were all killed off. So like she's going to become the new Valkyrie. That makes the most sense to me. Loki, of course, goes back to doing the Loki stuff, going back to doing like mischievous things. But probably the biggest set of events here, the biggest change to come out of all of this, is that following the defeat of Malekith and all of his forces, everything returning to the status quo, the one big change that comes out, Odin steps aside and says, you are now the All-Father, which is really Jason Aaron's way of explaining how it is that Thor became that character in the future anyway. I mean, we are always kind of left to assume that Odin just died somewhere along the line. Either he died in battle with like Surtur, or he just died of old age, or whatever the case is, because Asgardians can die of old age. He basically died and that left the mantle open for Thor. Instead, that doesn't happen. Instead, what goes on here is Odin actually steps aside and says, you are now the new All-Father. Like you are now the new ruler of Asgard. You are essentially the new Odin. It's pretty sweet. It's pretty badass. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.